Hello folks, and welcome to Mini of the Month for May 2021. This is the inaugural Mini of the Month. So before we start the miniature, this is the miniature by the way, say hello to the Vampire Hunter. Before we make a start on the Vampire Hunter, I just want to go over a quick couple of things about working with printed resin miniatures for the uninitiated. So if you have not worked with printed resin miniatures before, then just a very quick talk through of that. It is necessary in order to make sure that these things print properly to apply support structures to them. You may have seen pictures of miniatures with support structures before. They're like these scaffolds that kind of come up and around the miniature in various places, holding parts of it up while it's printing. And these, when the miniature is supplied to you, are mostly removed. In some cases, if it's a particularly fragile part where it's very hard to get the supports off without doing any damage to the miniature, then those supports may be left on. There are some instances where this isn't true, like for example the supports around this lantern. This lantern probably will snap in shipping, but it always snaps exactly here and it's very easy to glue back on. This one was glued back on, and as you can see, you cannot tell at all that it was glued back on, so it's no problem. But in some cases there will be supports still on parts. In this miniature in particular, there is a support that connects his collar to the brim of his hat here, so that his hat can print overhanging his face nicely. That just needs to be gently rocked off with a pair of side cutters. But other than that, he comes pretty clean, and there might just be a little bit of scraping, much like you would do with a plastic miniature, just to get the surfaces flat. But other than that, he'll be ready to go. I've undercoated our example in matte black because we're going to be painting a lot of natural tones today and painting a lot of dark colours today, so a matte black is a good starting point anyway, and I just personally prefer matte black as a starting point. So let's have a start on painting the Vampire Hunter for May. Okay, so to begin with, there's kind of two ways I like to work on miniatures like this. Either in order of what is deepest inside the sculpt first. So essentially, painting something the way it would get dressed. I think that's a very reliable way to paint a miniature. I also really enjoy the method of just painting, the things that cover the maximum amount of surface in the miniature first. So in that case, what I'm actually going to do is start off with a really dark brown here and start to base coat his overcoat, and I'm also going to do his boots in this same colour. We're going to work with a lot of natural tones on this. I believe I mentioned that in the preamble. There's going to be a lot of browns, so we're going to be working with different ways to kind of vary your browns up, so that you don't end up with all the same colour. That can be a real pitfall for some folk. We're going to figure out how to not do that. So I've just got some nice thinned paint off the wet palette here, and you can see the consistency of my paint. It flows very nicely, but I haven't thinned it so much that it doesn't cover. And that's kind of the important balance to strike. When thinning your paints, do a few little test passes and thin it essentially to be as thin as possible whilst still achieving a level of coverage that you're happy with. That would be my sort of top tip for how to thin your paints. Probably not the hottest take in the history of takes, but that's sort of where I think about it. So here I've spotted an area where we're going to want to infill the hair before we finish this brown, and that's one of the reasons why I'm starting with an area that is of the maximum coverage of the model, an area that covers a lot of the surface area. If you ever see that white flashing, by the way, that's just me refocusing the camera. I'm just checking my preview window, and if it looks like it's not quite focused well, then that's just me refocusing, so don't be alarmed at that. So yeah, the hair here is going to be quite hard to paint without clipping the collar. So even though I've painted the collar in, we're probably going to have to go in there and work on the hair before we go any further with this leather workup. So So one of the things that's going to differ with these videos, with these mini of the month videos, is that when I do a tutorial, I tend to skip all of the stuff like this, you know, the infill process and things like that. I would normally skip over that and not present it for you. The reason I'm including it here is because I want you to be able to see, like, for example, what I do when I need to reach into a little nook, how I handle that. I want you to be able to essentially have a complete idea of how I'm painting this miniature. So that's why these are sort of in a long play format, and that's also why they're going to feature lots of the kind of thing that wouldn't normally make it into one of my tutorials. So there are buckles on these boots, but we're going to be doing a simple non-metallic later on in this process, and so I'm just filling the buckles in the same colour as the boot itself, because the non-metallic will start with a brown anyway, so it will work as a nice base coat for that. You're going to be learning all sorts of techniques when you follow these videos, and obviously, you know, we won't be going into super depth on these techniques when we cover them, because that is saved for, you know, specific focused tutorials, but you should get enough out of them to have a reasonable working idea of how to start playing with that particular technique or skill. And from there, you know, a lot of the fun can be just going out and exploring and finding your way of doing it, and not worrying about doing it in the, you know, in the same way as the person that you first saw do it or whatever. It's certainly, for me, that's been a lot of the fun that I've had with painting over the years, is taking ideas that I've seen elsewhere and going off and kind of formulating my own takes on those. Are you a seam or are you trim? Can be difficult to see sometimes. Even with the best of lighting, it can be difficult to see. That is actually trim. Okay, so there's trim that runs under his glove. That's something worth noting. And these gloves are of the fingerless variety, so remember to leave the fingertips unpainted so that we can come back in and do some skin tone on those later. Another glove here. And again, you can see sometimes you have to pull some pretty weird angles with your brush to hit some of these nooks and crannies. And one of the things that owning a 3D printing business and being a fan of 3D printed miniatures has kind of made me realise is a lot of the stuff that you have to do to kind of finagle these single piece miniatures is really great training for when you are painting multi-part kits and you don't want to sub-assemble a certain section. Sub-assemble a certain section. It's a mouthful. So it's actually kind of been interesting the last couple of months, sort of starting to play with this technology and get to know it and start to work with it, because it's kind of teaching me things about painting by process of the fact that, you know, a lot of the 3D printed miniatures don't come in kits, they come as single pieces like this. That's not to say that they all do, there's certainly plenty that do come in kits. The Cyclops that we've recently added to the website is a very simple kit that's about 5 pieces. But then, for example, this isn't a miniature that we sell. This is a miniature from Piper Makes, and that's just a handful of its components. So you can see that 3D printed resin miniatures can be incredibly complex, and they can come in a whole bunch of pieces and be very similar to, you know, your sort of Games Workshop and similar kind of hobby kits, or they can be really nice, straightforward and simple pieces like this. And I think what I love about this is that this is the kind of play piece that if you paint this to a nice standard, it could happily be an avatar for somebody's character. But if you wanted to do a sort of faster, dirtier job of it, it could also just as easily be started painting that brown just under here, but I actually am not going to be keeping that brown, so that'll be changing. Could just as easily be an NPC, and you could just do a quicker paint job on it. And indeed, it could even represent, you know, a relatively low-level NPC, something like, you know, the head of a town militia or something. And I like the fact that some of these miniatures have a lot of range to them. They could be many different things. So for now, that's just some brown base coated in. And next we're going to start to look at just a couple of the deeper, more underneath layers to get those blocked in. So we'll be back in just a second to start that after this dries. Okay, so I'm back, and whilst this was drying, I was having a bit of a think about how I want to tackle this. I want the underclothing to be grey, because I want a lot of drab tones here. That kind of suits the, you know, the gothic horror kind of feel. Just noticed I missed the very tip of his nose there. So I want a grey, and then I think also I want like a grey to white kind of hair colour. So again, this is another opportunity to kind of base coat a lot of stuff in the same colour, which is quite handy. So I'm going to mix a grey, and the reason I'm going to mix a grey, just refocus on my wet palette a second so that you can see it. The reason I'm going to mix a grey here is just because I'm not likely to be painting more than one of this miniature, so the chances of needing to colour match are pretty low. And so with that in mind, I can just go for exactly the grey that I want by mixing. So I want to start off with something pretty dark so that I've got room to colour up. And I'm going to achieve that just by additive mixing, starting from the light colour. If I wanted a light finished colour, I would start with the dark colour. If I want a dark finished colour, I would start with the light colour. And so I'm just subtracting lightness until I get to how dark I want it. I think about there is something like what I'm looking for. There's probably paints out of the pot that are this shade of grey. In fact, I'm almost 100% certain that there are paints out of the pot that are this shade of grey. But I think when we're just doing a single miniature, and I've always got black and white on my palette, I literally never start a palette without black and white. So it just makes sense to mix here. I think that's about the colour that I'm going to go with. I quite like that. So, bringing our mini back into shot and refocusing again, we can start looking at some greys. So there is both the hint of an undergarment here and just here. But that's about it there. There is the hair, which, as I said, I want to get painted in now so that I can freely continue with the brown workup, and I can't continue with the brown workup while the hair isn't painted, because I will 100% hit it. I'm hitting it now as I'm base coating it. The idea with these tutorials obviously being start to finish in a single session, but you know, to as high a standard as possible. So I want to be able to make things look nice in an efficient way, which sometimes means, you know, stopping a workup to go back and address something as a matter of efficiency. So whilst it would be nice to just start the brown and then finish it, I think it makes more sense in this case to just lay the rough brown down and then start to address some of the greys. The detail on the sculpt is absolutely lovely. This is actually not printed on my production printer either. This was printed on my 2K printer, the example that I'm working on here. And the print quality really does capture all the detail of the sculpt, even on a 2K printer. The 4K production printer doesn't even find a job of this, and I actually ran off a batch of 12 of these yesterday and was very, very impressed by just how beautiful the detail level is on this sculpt. And just under here we've got that bit of the undergarment that I painted brown earlier when I shouldn't have. And obviously, you know, those under areas, they're never really going to be seen anyway, so if you are a slower painter and you're looking for ways to cut corners, then obviously just skipping over bits like that isn't going to do much harm. I'm going to try and put my best foot forward, and I think now that I'm sort of starting to analyse everything, the head of this mace is probably also going to be some sort of dirty metal, so we will get some grey base coated onto that, and then what I think I'll probably do is the overlaid clasps we'll do in our same non-metallic gold that we're going to be doing for the lining of the coat. As I say, don't be alarmed by that if you've never tried it before. This is a good opportunity to give it a go, because we're going to be doing quite a simplified non-metallic. It's not going to be hyper complex, and you're going to be able to sort of tailor it to your ability level. There'll be sort of optional steps that you can choose to not tackle if you don't feel comfortable doing them. And of course, you know, the golden rule also applies that this is your miniature, and you know, my guide for how to paint the miniature is how I want to paint the miniature, but you don't have to agree with 100% of my decisions. You can absolutely choose to paint certain things in other ways. So I think that's everything that's going to be silver metallic and everything that's going to be grey. Let me just double check over the sculpt briefly. There is a dagger holster there, but again, that's going to be in the gold non-metallic stuff. I think that is everything. Okay, so let's work at some of these greys now. I want to add a touch of white in, and I want to start to just volumetrically light the clothing. The hair we can also start picking out now. I'm just going to sort of streak onto parts of the hair that the light would catch. And the nice thing is that because he's wearing a brimmed hat, a lot of the hair would not catch the light, and so we actually are incentivized to keep it pretty dark. But when it comes to the clothing, we're going to be highlighting by volume, so anything that is facing upwards, because the light source is above our character, it's going to get a lot of light, and then anything that is sort of below the horizon will get very little light. And so we'll start to just build some volume into these greys. The weapon parts for the silver I'll actually come back to later. We'll do all the non-metallics one after the other, essentially. So I won't start those yet. Couple of reasons. I personally feel that anything that is a bit more complex on the paint job, so you know, let's not pretend that the non-metallic is going to be, you know, the easiest part of the job. I don't think it's going to be as scary as perhaps some people watching this may presume, but it's not going to be super easy. And so, you know, it's nice to just be a little bit warmed up before you tackle stuff like that. Whereas, you know, if something is definitely going to be pretty straightforward, then it's worth getting into straight away and just kind of getting it checked off. So when it comes to the non-metallic parts, we'll wait until we're a little ways in before we start to address them, so that we can just be a bit more warmed up. So I'm adding some more white now. This is where things will start to get pretty bright, so we're going to have to start just being fairly selective with where we place the brush and how we lay the paint in. Everywhere where I find little scratches and seam lines on his clothing, I'm trying to remember, apologies for being off camera there for a minute, trying to remember to place a little highlight underneath them just to pick them out. It's one of those areas where it's not necessarily realistic to do that, but it makes the sculpt look a lot more readable. You can see, if you look at this arm here, for example, just here, creases are a lot more readable because I've purposefully picked them out. And again, when it comes to the hair, it makes sense to just start getting some of that dyed in. You see here, as part of my process, I'm not really worried about if I overspill onto other things. I've got a bit of grey on the mace here and stuff like that. I always think it's better to try not to sweat that kind of thing and just let it be, and you can work it out later. You know, it's, if you let it distract you from the current process that you're working on, then it can lead to you sort of struggling to get the paint down how you want it looking. Whereas if you just wait and go back and correct it when you're ready in your own time, then it's just a little bit less irritating and there'll be less stress. One of the key things, if we're trying to finish a miniature to a fairly nice standard in a single session, one of the key things is, I think, making it as stress-free as possible, making it feel as relatively simple and straightforward as can be. Because to me, the main barrier to getting painting done is usually motivation for the actual painting itself. We all have a strong desire to get our miniatures painted, but some days the motivation to actually sit down and do the painting can be a bit lacking, and so I try to always paint in such a way that really minimises the stress levels. Okay, we're starting to get somewhere now. Undergarment here, sort of a tiny amount of highlight, but I'm really not worried about too much highlight being present on that because it is very much in shadow. It's very little that you can see of it anyway. I'll pick out one more highlight on the clothing. So this is just a 3-stage highlight. We base coat, and then we add 3 stages of lighter paint. And you can see here that as we get to each layer of lighter paint, we're also just shrinking the amount of real estate on the miniature that it covers. So we don't need to blend anything because we're encouraging the eye to fill in those blends. And the eye will do that quite happily, providing we give it not too big a jump between each colour. If the leaps from colour to colour get too big, that's when your eye starts to go, hang on, that isn't blended. But as long as you keep everything fairly close together, then it will appear far smoother than it really is. And one of the things that we have to often bear in mind with stuff like this, I'll just pull in a touch closer for you there, is that the camera will expose inconsistencies and defects that the naked eye can't even see. So always judge with your eyes, not with your camera lens. Camera lenses are better than the human eye at seeing detail. They'll find things that you'll never see when you look at it. So don't be put off if you get, all the way to the end of a piece and you look at it and you say, oh, it's not as clean as it looked when I was working on it, or it's not as vibrant or whatever. Chances are, to the eye, it probably looks better than it does to the camera. I find that that's almost always true. So I'm also just popping back in with the previous tones here just to tidy up a little, and I'll sort of do that ad hoc as I'm going. Where I see that I need it, I'll do it. I'll sometimes add in a little bit of deliberate texture if I feel like a surface is getting a bit boring or a bit flat, that kind of thing. You can see that those grey undergarments now are all sort of starting to really have a good bit of shape to them. They're becoming quite readable. We're going to go just on the hair, because we want the hair to read as more of a sort of white grey. We're just going to go a couple of stages lighter in a few areas. So at the very front of the hair here, for example, I'm just going to run in a few. Apologies. Still learning where the camera is, so if I do veer off, I assure you I am checking regularly, so I will get back into shots so that you can see what I'm showing you. We're just picking out strands of hair, because we want that kind of grey-white sort of complexion to the hair. Be the case that just the very back part of the head here, it's very, very difficult to get at, so we might have to again pull some weird hand angles to achieve that. There is an ear just showing through there as well, it's worth noting. But now I think I'm in a position where I can just come back in and correct out the bits where I overflowed into what should be brown. So we can now get that nice bit of tidying up done and then have a much clearer idea of how we're looking. You see on the back of the collar there, it's particularly noticeable. Just up in this section here. Should be in pretty good shape from there. Just a little stripe up there. Okay. So now we can start to get on with processing this dark brown. I think now is the right time to do it as well. So this is a fun little trick. It's a very good way to handle brown leathers, in my opinion. So we're just going to give everything a few minutes just to make sure that it's definitely 100% dry, and then we'll get on with that. Okay, so this is where we're at. Everything is now dry. We can carry on. And the next trick is going to be to get this leather all looking nice. So, what is the method? What is the method? Well, this is counterintuitive to some people, so I'm always interested to hear people's thoughts on this, but I think orange is the best colour for highlighting leather. And what I'll tend to do is that as I get towards the end of the highlight, I'll start to desaturate the orange by adding some white in. But initially, what you're going to want is just a good, solid coverage orange. So I use this Cador Red highlight from P3 because the coverage is very, very good with it. It's really opaque as orange paints go. A lot of orange paints really are not very opaque. So what I'm going to do is to start out with, just mix it into my dark brown. And that's going to give me quite an interesting sort of very earthy tone, which is part of the reason why I enjoy working with it so much, because leather is a natural material and I think it's very easy to make leather look unnatural. We're going to get to have some fun now, because we are painting something that wants a lot of texture. So what we're actually going to do is just use the tip of the brush and sculpt in texture while we create our highlights. And this first pass is fairly comprehensive. Most of the leather, except for maybe the deepest shadow, will get a touch at this early stage. And then we'll continue to build up lighter and lighter, and as we get into the lighter colours, it'll start to become less about highlighting and more about texture. But I want you to be really unafraid to just have plenty of streaky, gritty texture all over this. Because at the end of the day, worn leather is just full of texture. Just go and look at a piece if you have access to one, or if not, then grab Google and take a look on Google. You will see very quickly just how much of a vibrantly textural surface worn leather is, and facilitating that in paint is not only beautiful but incredibly fun. That's one of the reasons why I started painting leather this way in the first place, is just because it's so enjoyable, but the end product is also really pretty to look at. So like I say, we're being pretty careless with this first pass. We're not really looking to be particularly accurate. We're just sort of laying in very highly textured foundations for highlights. One of the things you will notice with this long play format is that you will see me going off camera a lot more. I wanted to talk about that briefly while we're painting together. When I paint tutorials for YouTube, I only have to sort of film 30 seconds to a minute of each process, and then the rest of the painting I'm doing off camera. But painting accurately and cleanly is very, very difficult to do on camera. It's something that you'll find even folks like the Warcom team have spoken about it a lot. I've seen various sort of social media posts by those guys where they'll talk about how painting on camera is far more difficult than it looks. And when it comes to YouTube, I need to sort of get in at least 30 seconds to a minute of the process so that I can show it to you, and then I can start start to just kind of paint freely and concentrate more on making it look good than on you being able to see it. And that's why it tends to sort of work really well on YouTube. Whereas when we do long play stuff like this, where you're seeing every part of the process, what you're going to see is me kind of remembering every now and again to make sure that I'm on camera, so I check my preview screen and move back into shot if I've drifted, but you will see me drifting out of shot. And the reason for that is just because I'm focused more on making it look as good as possible than anything else. But that said, I understand that an element of this is a painting guide or a tutorial of a manner of speaking. Not really a tutorial in the strictest sense, but certainly something that you will be studying from, and therefore you do need to see the miniature. So I do make all efforts to make sure that I get key parts of the process in shot so that you can see what's going on. But if the shot does ever drift, then try to bear with it, because I do look up and I check my preview monitor regularly. So I will move back into shot every time I move out of shot. It's just kind of the nature of doing this in the long play format instead of in the sort of short snippety format of YouTube. Let me just get into the tail end of texturing this leather now. At this point we've probably been painting, or I've probably been painting for about 45 minutes, something like that. So, as you can see, we're getting a pretty nice result for the amount of time that we're investing. It's not taking too long to get each of these workups done. One thing I've ummed and ahed about a lot when deciding to start making these videos of this nature was whether or not we'd cover the basing as part of it. I think with these being, most of these miniatures are probably going to be geared more towards the sort of Dungeons and Dragons kind of theme than tabletop war games, and so I think that perhaps a lot of DMs will already sort of have a way that they do all of their basing. So whilst there will at least be a nod to the basing, it probably won't be a big feature of the video, because at the end of the day, with a miniature like this, and with the kind of miniatures that we'll be doing in Mini of the Month, the odds of you wanting to base yours in the same way that I want to base mine are probably pretty slim. Imagine very seldom will it be the case that how I decide to do it will be how you decide to do it. And even miniatures like this that are supplied with a base, we don't supply all of our miniatures on the website with bases, because a lot of them we understand that chances are you're either going to want a plain base that you can add texture paints and the like to, in which case you're probably just going to buy packs of plastic ones because that's far cheaper than resin. Or if you do want a sculpted base, then you're going to want to choose a sculpted base that suits. So we try to price everything a little bit lower to account for the fact that you're probably going to have to buy a pack of bases, whether that be from us or from another store. But that is, it's another contributing reason as to why I don't want to go into mega detail when it comes to the basing of the miniatures for Mini of the Month. It's an interesting way that my body decided to involuntarily pronounce a word that I've said many times. I love that when your body just randomly malfunctions when you're trying to do something. It's especially helpful when you are a content creator. The number number of times I've had to retake a section of video purely because my body decided to just say something in a really weird way. Sometimes I'll make a joke out of it and include it in the video, and sometimes it's just not funny to even do so I won't bother. There we are. So that's the first run of texturing. It gets us to a pretty good place. I'm going to, between shots, just try to adjust the angle of the light a little bit because it's casting a lot of shadows. That is not super helpful. So we'll be going on to the next set of textures in just a moment. When I come back, I'm going to try and get the light positioned a bit better for you as well. And that was instantly successful. Silly me, this is the first time setting the cameras up in this way, so I didn't think about the angle that the light was sort of attacking my workspace from, and I completely reversed the angle to the opposite direction, and it made a huge difference. So the lighting should now be way better for the shots. You know, I can certainly see on the preview screen that everything's a bit easier to see now. So I've just added some more orange now, and I'm just going to start building in more texture, much as I did on the last run, but again just a bit more refined now, shrunken down a little. It's important to remember that we're serving two functions here when we're painting this texture. We're both creating highlights and we're creating visual interest through texture. And so as a result, because we're trying to satisfy both of those needs, we don't want to just kind of do one run and done, because then we'd end up with either pretty basic looking highlights and very aggressive texture, or we'd end up with nice texture but it wouldn't be providing any kind of real highlight. So because we're trying to fulfill both of those tasks in a single application, it's important to just kind of think about building things up with a few layers and being more and more refined as we continue to do that. And you can see that even just with this second layer on, it immediately starts to reveal the effect that we're achieving. The first layer is a little bit abstract. It's a bit hard to sort of say, what is this actually doing, and get any kind of definitive answer. But by the time we reach this second layer now, starts to become very obvious the effect that it's having. All of that texture just building up really nicely. As much as I say with some surety, you know, you don't want to really do just one layer of texturing here. Equally, you shouldn't feel like you have to do a million. You know, when you're satisfied with how it looks, when you're satisfied with the balance of texture and highlighting that you've achieved, that's the time to stop. Because continuing to work something like this to death is guaranteed to feel tedious. It's not something that you want to subject yourself to. Plus, you know, there's that time crunch as well, because, like I say, the intention is to do this in a single session of painting, and so, you know, it wants to be something that you can achieve in that scope, and that's going to vary person to person. Some people are going to be quicker painters than I am, and some people are going to be slower painters than I am, and so what's actually achievable in that single session time frame is going to be variable. So just bear that in mind. You know, don't feel like there is a set amount of this that you have to apply. It is as little or as much as you think looks good. I would just make sure that you do at least 2 passes minimum, just to create some tonal variance, because otherwise the texture's not going to look very interesting with just one layer of one colour. Definitely starts to look pretty interesting pretty quickly though. There's no doubt about that. Feet, obviously I'll focus mostly towards the tops of the feet because that's where the highlight will live, but again, because we are incorporating texture, it doesn't hurt to just give at least some love to other spots as well. Probably knock a bit more exposure off of this shot. Maybe something like that. Yeah, makes it a little easier. It's one of the things about filming stuff like this is that you constantly have to adjust exposure because certain workups are just really hard to see with the exposure high. And certain workups are really hard to see with the exposure low. So it's not just about kind of creating the level of brightness to the shot that you want, it's also about ensuring that the important things that need to be visible can be seen and interpreted. It's a whole separate hobby learning to film your painting, and for any of you out there that are good with cameras, especially in the video format, you will know just how much in-depth knowledge is required to get really, really beautiful video. And I do not possess that knowledge. I am very much a novice when it comes to understanding my camera equipment and how to get the most out of it. So for me, it means lots of adjusting on the fly, lots of constantly tinkering and tweaking and getting things just so for each shot. Okay, it's starting to look really nice now. It's starting to come together. We'll give it one more pass of orange and then we will do a desaturated run as well with some white. So just one more mix of orange in now. Really have to start being more careful here. You notice that there's a bit less commentary and a bit more just letting you watch, then that's probably because I'm concentrating a little bit more intensely for this last section, just to try to ensure that I don't put any big old conspicuous blobs of orange in places where they're going to look silly. Of course, it's worth pointing out here as well that Games Workshop did just release a product called Cursed City, which I'm sure plenty of folk watching this will have picked up. And a lot of these techniques, things like these worn leathers and stuff like that, will serve you real well for painting up Cursed City. So maybe you picked up this Vampire Hunter as a practice miniature before you get started on your Cursed City box. Maybe you're considering trying to hunt down one of the few copies that's still in the wild and wanted to try something in the style first, but if Cursed City is the reason that you found yourself watching this video, then rest assured that the techniques that we're covering will absolutely they will 100% serve you for painting Cursed City. We're down to pretty fine, pretty minute strokes at this stage, so that should give you an idea of the final layer, the one that actually has some white introduced into it. That should give you an idea of just how little paint we'll actually be applying to the miniature when we get to that layer. It's very much a finishing process. The addition of the white is really just to push forward the contrast here and there by just adding some desaturation in certain areas. This is really the final highlight. I'm going to take a quick couple of seconds just to flex my fingers, and then we will be back with the final process on the leather. But right, so for the final layer that includes the white, we really do need to be being pretty conservative with our brush strokes at this point, so that's why I just took a little second there. We really just want to be hitting the sort of final terminations of shapes. Just those last little bits, and again, you know, because we're incorporating texture at the same time, don't be scared to drop in a dotted line here or there, or a scratch. In fact, probably a lot of what I put in here will be scratches more than actual highlights. to things like knuckles and the ends of fingers. One of the other fun things about this long play format that I hadn't considered when I first decided to start making these videos is that there'll also be, inevitably at some point, mistakes that I will make that you will get to enjoy seeing me correct in real time. And that's something that I'm actually quite keen to show people. How to fix mistakes is a big part of taking that layer of stress out of your painting activities, and you know, making it feel more like fun. Knowing how to cope with mistakes, what you can do in the event that you have, you know, a major hiccup, you know, what the fixes are, that kind of thing. That's really handy knowledge, and a lot of it, unfortunately, and I'm really not a fan of this kind of knowledge, but a lot of it does just come from experience, sadly. And the reason I say I'm not a fan of that is because I think that so often that is used as a cop-out for people not having the energy or the interest in fully explaining certain things. And I'm not talking about painting specifically, I'm talking about, you know, life in general. Oh, you'll figure it out when you're older sort of attitude. We often sort of go through life waiting for this miraculous moment when we figure out all these things that we were told that we'd figure out when we're older, and you know, it quite often never comes. But sadly, what to do in the event of XY mistake is one of those things that you really get a feel from through experience. And so being able to do stuff like this, you know, create these videos where you can pass on that experience-based learning so that other people don't have to clock the miles before they know how to handle those situations. I think that's a pretty powerful thing, and I think that's, you know, an area where video format learning that can be, you know, easily shared via the internet becomes pretty cool, and I guess to an extent pretty unique as well. There's not really many other learning formats where that can be the case so easily. So you can see that the addition of this desaturated colour sort of is helping to knock back some of that kind of orangey gingeriness that the leather was starting to pick up. So we've still got really cool, interesting, highly textured leather, which is nice to look at, but we're not falling into that territory where perhaps it's getting a bit too red looking and unrealistic. You know, we've still got that nice kind of desaturated, scratchy leather, which is certainly what I like to see. Okay, I think we are nearing being done with leather. I'm just sort of seeking last little bits and bobs, but I think for the most part we are done. That's really nice and textural. There's a lot going on there visually, which when you've got so much real estate on a miniature covered by, you know, the same colour. Being able to introduce all that extra visual interest, I think, is a very useful tool. You can see that what we've got there is, you know, there's a lot going on. There's plenty to look at to keep the viewer busy. So we'll go on to a second tone of leather now to do some of these belts and stuff. Okay, next on the list, I want to get some red leather on this, as mentioned before. So what I've done here is I actually took the same base brown that I started the jacket in, that really dark brown. It's actually Rhine Oxide from Citadel, if you're interested in specifically what paint. And I've cut that with just some bright red. So I'm going to just tap in this red into things like the belts. We've got obviously rings and bindings and stuff on the belts as well to consider, so we don't need to go too ham on getting stuff in. And I think as a base colour, what I'm actually going to do is his little face covering, because our Vampire Hunter is COVID aware, so I'm just going to use the same base tone, and we'll do a little slightly divergent workup on there, but starting from the same base to give the frog in my throat. Something I unfortunately suffer from a lot when I do extended periods of talking, which is another reason why I don't tend to do as much of that kind of long play and live content these days as I used to. Okay, so we're getting that based in everywhere that it needs to be. This is kind of a little tool belt thing here. I'm going to kind of go for like a light tan leather for that again, just for a bit more variance. Be all the dark leather, I believe, or all the red leather, should I say. Use the correct word, please. Right. So, what I'm going to do, as I said, is a couple of divergent workups. I won't really need to save any of this original colour, but I am just going to pop a dot of it aside just in case. So for the red leather, I'm going to highlight up again by adding an orange first of all. Just straight into an orange. And again, I'm keeping things oriented in a textural direction. I'm maybe not being as obsessive over texture as I was for the main bulk of the leather, but that's because this is just a kind of small addition, so it's a little less important that we do that. And again, just some more orange. Okay, and some more orange. Now we're getting quite bright. It's nice doing a workup like this on such a small area after doing a similar workup on such a big area, because it feels so much easier once you've had that warm up of the big area first. Doing it again in, you know, the same sort of workup but just in different colours sort of feels a hell of a lot easier. Again. There we are. And then exactly the same tactic as with the brown leather, just a dab of white now, just to bring in some desaturation at the top end. Okay, simple as that. And then, like I said, we're starting from the same base colour for the little shawl thing, but we'll be doing a different workup. And what I'm actually going to do is wait until we've got the skin tone down before I do that workup, because we're very likely, when we're painting the skin tones again, to paint over that. So we'll save that one for a minute. So next on the list of various leathers is going to be more of a lighter leather, so we're heading, I guess, a little more in a sort of tanned leather kind of direction now. So we're going for more of a sort of medium brown, or more kind of orangey brown in this instance, and we're just going to base coat essentially this little patch of tools on his belt. That's pretty much the main thing that's in this colour. We will also use this as a base coat for the stakes that he's got here. So there's those. I'm probably going to do them as like a really pale, almost kind of birch-like wood, but this works as a base coat, so there's no reason to not get ahead of ourselves and get another process ticked off. It's one more thing we won't have to do later on if we've got areas base coated before we come in to begin them. So, okay, let's finish getting this tool belt locked in. There is a scabbard here that's got some wraps around it. I'm going to do the scabbard itself black, but I want to block the wraps in this colour. Put those in. And you notice this brown is, so what I'm actually using is, again, I will name my colours when I remember to, but it's really not super important. You should kind of just be using whatever colours you've got and you like painting with. You're going to get these effects by applying the techniques that I apply and using any sort of approximation of the colours that I use, so don't feel like you have to go with exactly what I do. But I'm using Mornfang Brown from Citadel, which is, if you are even remotely familiar with my painting prior to watching this, you will be aware that that's a colour that I use a whole bunch of, and always has been. So there's absolutely no surprise whatsoever to find me using it for a tutorial like this. Okay, a quick sip of coffee. Always important to have lots of strong milky coffee available when you're painting, I think. And then the other thing, this might be a bit of a surprise to some of you at least, is Anywhere that we're painting gold, we're also going to base coat in this colour. So we're going to grab the belt buckle here. We're going to grab all of the trim of the jacket. Some of these bits are a little tricky, especially like, for example, there's an area here where I just had to pop a bit of liquid green stuff in because the sculpt got a little bit damaged when I was removing supports. Again, just a thing that can happen, but it does mean that you might have to take a bit of special care when painting that area, because you'll not be dealing with a perfect part of the miniature, you'll be dealing with a damaged part of the miniature. So may just take a little extra care just to bring it in line and get it behaving how you want it to. Can you see how, even though we've not been working on this for super long, I think we're probably still at the sub 2 hour mark. I haven't edited this together yet, so I don't know how long it actually is, but as I say, the only things that I'm leaving out here is the drying times. So the video length will be a great indicator of approximately how long this paint job actually takes. So it'll be pretty much an exact indicator of how long the paint job takes. It just won't allow for drying time. So, but you can see that we're starting to show a level of completion now, just because of the number of colours that are now present on the miniature. So that's a very handy thing. And part of that is this process of base coating as you go, sort of making sure that you prepare things before you start painting that area. So again, anything that's going to be gold, we're currently painting in this Mornfang brown. It's a Citadel paint if you're not familiar with Citadel. They use a ton of their stuff outside of my YouTube tutorials, to be honest. I mainly use their stuff for my YouTube tutorials because it's the most popular brand of paint. So it's what people like to see tutorials in. People like to kind of feel like they can just kind of pick up the exact paint you used and recreate what you've done. So, you know, for other people's convenience, I tend to use it a lot there. But in my own painting, when I'm painting for my own leisure, I really favour P3, Reaper, Vallejo, most of the other brands, weirdly enough, over Citadel. I just tend to find that the majority of the Citadel paints are a lot harder to apply than offerings from other brands. It tends to be the thing. I don't find the Citadel paints very user friendly. But, you know, for every rule there is an exception, right? And when I'm making, it was its busiest two tutorials a week. I've recently gone down to 1 tutorial a week. They're not always tutorials either, to be fair, but when you're working in that kind of volume, you know, there are some that will, even if the range as a whole you don't generally get on with, there's going to be one or two paints that kind of slip in there and become regulars just because they are, you know, the odd sort of standout goodies in the bunch. And that's very much the thing with colours like Mornfang Brown and Rhinoxide, you know, the two main browns that we've used on this piece. Whilst, you know, the range as a whole is not very user-friendly in my opinion, the browns in particular, and the base paints, if we were to actually be sort of trying to zone in on a range, Citadel's base paints in particular, I find really good fun, really easy to work with. I like the range of colours that's available, you know, they've got a lot going for them. And weirdly, despite the fact that they are the range that Citadel was formulated to be the highest coverage, which they are, like of the Citadel paints, they absolutely are the highest coverage. One of the things I really love using them for is making glazes. I find them really, really effective at making glazes. Again, just base coating parts that need to be gold. There we are. And again, I do apologise for the number of off-camera moments. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it's just kind of the nature of doing this type of content. Almost impossible to be on camera or in shot 100% of the time because you just have to maneuver the miniature around to get into the nooks and crannies and stuff. But then I suppose on the other side of that you get to see what I do with manoeuvring the mini around to get into the nooks and crannies and stuff. So, you know, there is that. It is a game of two halves. It is a sword of two edges. It is various other things. And we're nearly there on this trim now. And like I said, this is going to be a simplified non-metallic metal. So don't be alarmed at the idea of prepping for non-metallic metal. Don't feel like you're gonna get there and hate it. It's a pretty fun non-metallic. It's one that I've used a few times for various different pieces. It tends to be, if I am painting miniatures for a studio to use for, like, you know, promotional art and that kind of thing, it's the type of non-metallic that I would use for those kind of jobs where you want the miniature to look a bit posh, but it is a game piece, so you're trying not to push too far on the render quality, because you know you want the piece to look approachable, which is an odd brief for professional painters, but actually a surprisingly common one. Quite often you sort of do have to pump the brakes a little bit on just how far you push the rendering on a job, so as to make it feel inviting and not kind of, I don't like to use the word unobtainable, because I personally don't think any of the painting I do is ever unobtainable. I don't believe that I'm one of those kind of painters, but probably is the correct word nonetheless. Yeah, whether you like it or not, some things are called something. got another couple of buckles on the back of the boots and a couple of straps which we can fill in with this colour. Going to get a lot of mileage out of this brown, which is a good thing. You know, like I talk about, I think I've already mentioned it at least once in this video, I talk about integrating efficiency into your painting so as to kind of maximise what you get for the amount of effort you put in. One of the key sort of philosophies behind that is the idea of painting efficiently. You know, if it makes sense to use the same base colour for a bunch of different workups, then do so, because all that's going to do is make you faster. That's literally the only effect that that will have. It will not make your paint job look any worse. It will not cost you anything. It will not set you back in any way. The only effect is that it will make you faster. So starting from the same base colour for a number of different workups is a really good way to just save some smart time. Also, when I'm painting pieces like this that are intended, you know, for something like Dungeons and Dragons, it's intended to be a game piece, as well as, you know, using quick versions of complicated workups, like for example the non-metallic that we're going to be doing shortly. I will also very much obey the rule of, if it's too hard to reach, then it's in too deep a shadow to need painting. And that's one of the reasons why I like the black undercoat, because I do think that actually, as well as being a pain and being slow and being, you know, extremely difficult to paint those kind of deep recesses well, if something is so far set back that you physically cannot reach it with your paintbrush, then it probably is in very deep shadow. And when you look at miniatures where those very deep shadows have been rendered in full colour, they quite often look unrealistic. I mean, again, I hate to bring it up because I feel like it's a bit of an perhaps over-explored conversation, but Games Workshop's painting style tends to pay very little attention to lighting, and you know, it produces a certain look, and if that is a look that you like, then power to you. You know, everybody should be allowed to like the things that they like, and there is nothing bad at all to be taken from it if you like it. But for me, I just like the lighting of a miniature to be at least a consideration. You know, I'm not necessarily gonna always do these full, elaborate, ridiculous, fully lit pieces that, you know, every volume is painstakingly calculated and rendered, because that's not always fun. Painting is about having fun. But I like to at least have thought about light when I paint a piece, and demonstrate that I've at least thought about, at least put in some consideration to the lighting of a piece. I think that just overall makes for better miniatures in the long run. At least, you know, better by whatever lens I see miniatures by. Spot tidying up there. Right, so first of all, let's just quickly do this kind of tanned leather here. So to achieve that, I've actually got a little bit of Avalon Sunset on my palette, which is just like an oxide yellow. And I'm going to add some of that into some Mornfang Brown. And again, just kind of scratch things up a little. You know, not really needing to be crazy careful. Very little of this leather, so obviously it's not very hard to make it look good, and it makes sense to do so. And then just a little tap of white in there as well, just to finish that off. And then this is actually the first time you're going to see me use a wash in this video. I don't paint with washes that much when I'm painting my own style. The only time I really paint with washes is when I'm doing, again, mostly workups for YouTube. You know, kind of in that more sort of battle ready tabletop wargaming kind of sphere. But before I progress, this highlight colour also just happens to be, I said I wanted these to look kind of birchy. This highlight colour just happens to be a really good starting point for that as well. So we'll just continue to paint in these stakes. So yeah, we're going to grab a wash. We're going to grab Agrax Earthshade, which is, for my painting, is the most usable of the GW washes, because it is a very natural looking one. We're just going to run it over all of these pouches and accessories and stuff. By highlighting it first, what we're doing is basically just using this shade to kind of normalize the tones that are going on in there. And forgive my doorbell for ringing while we're filming. Just normalise the tones that are going on in there and just kind of introduce a bit of recess shading. And the same with these stakes. I'm just going to pull some shadow in towards the middle of them both. And that's also going to pick up a little bit of the sculpted grain, which is no bad thing. So now we'll let wash dry and then we'll move on to the next procedure. Okay, so now that that shade has dried, I just want to go back into my dark grey that we were basing our silvers with. And there's a couple of bits on that belt pouch that I want to pick out with it. So, for example, we've got a little spike here, a couple of little stoppered file things, which I'm going to say are silver. There's a little button just in there. I just want to get these prepped for being painted silver later on. There's another little button just there, which we can grab. There's a button there. There's a buckle there. And there's a ring just there, holding the belt onto that pouch thing. And then there is also the ring in his hand for the lantern. And obviously pretty happy for the framework of the lantern to be brass, because that's, you know, pretty common. If you've ever seen oil lanterns, it's quite common for them to be finished in a sort of brass-like or brass-looking metal. But what you will pretty much never see is the actual weight bearing ring, the one that it's got to hang off, being finished in brass, because brass doesn't do too well under loads. It's not very good at taking strain, so we go silver for the weight bearing ring and then brass for the other one. I also missed, when I was prepping golds, the giant buckle across his chest, you know, the biggest one on the whole miniature. So we'll just fill that in very briefly. Okay, and now we are where we should be. Right, so from here I want to get some gold non-metallic done now, because it's going to take a few minutes to do, you know, just because there's a fair bit of it. So I want to show you this very simple gold metallic workup. It always starts from Longform brown, and then we're going to want Avalon Sunset, and we're going to want some white. So Avalon Sunset, if you're not familiar, is another one of the Citadel base paints. Mine's decanted into a squeezy bottle, but it makes no difference. So we've already obviously got Mornfang down, so our next colour is going to be Mornfang and Avalon in equal parts. And I'm not going to thin this all the way to a glaze, like if you were doing like a big, you know, elaborate, complicated non-metallic, then you would probably do a lot of glazing. I'm going to keep all that minimal so as to, you know, make it easy. So I'm just, it is thinned, but it's not super thin. And what I'm going to do is just start to pick out some metallic light. When you light metallics, it's a bit different to when you light other things, because obviously the material itself is highly reflective, so it tends to push more light back at the viewer than a flat material would. So what I tend to recommend is that there's kind of two approaches you can take to highlighting metallic. Approach the first would be to study, which, you know, there's no two ways about it. That's going to take time. If you want to go and find references and study them and practice painting them, by all means. That is, you know, if you're trying to get to like the highest level of painting non-metallic metal, then that is definitely a very good idea, because you're going to want to have an intimate understanding. But if you want to just take a fast and dirty approach, which I often do, there's a lot of my painting that calls for a fast and dirty approach. And that's kind of why I use this style of non-metallic. What I'm instead going to do is just think about it like a normal volume, but just really exaggerate. You know, just think of it like a normal volume, but go way harder on the contrast. Because whilst highlight placement definitely matters, you know, you don't want to be placing a reflection where a shadow should live. That's going to look silly no matter what you do about it. But the biggest thing that tells the viewer's eye that something is made of metal when it's painted with flat paint is not the highlight placement, it's the contrast level. So for my fast and dirty non-metallic metals like we're going to do today, I just think here's some colours that vaguely represent the colours that would be in that metal. Now just push the contrast as hard as you can. And you know what? It has a pretty good track record of working for me. So it's not the most technical approach, it's not the most correct approach, but it gets me something that I like, and it's way, way quicker to apply than a really carefully considered and studied and planned observation-based metallic workup. So I'm not saying ever for a second that you shouldn't go off and learn observation-based painting and reference metal surfaces in order to learn how to do NMM. That is absolutely a valid way of doing it. It's absolutely a way that you may well decide that you want to do it. And if you do decide you want to do it that way, props to you, because you are choosing the longer path that produces, that has the higher ceiling to it. And that's great. But for purposes of, getting our minis painted for Dungeons and Dragons or Warhammer or whatever, tabletop game we're playing, if our aim is to get things painted so that we can play with them, and that is more important to us than the raw artistry, then we can still have minis that look lovely, but we can cut certain corners, shall we say. One of those corners that I think you can cut is when it comes to things like non-metallic metal, where you can definitely produce results that are beautiful, even if they're not quote-unquote correct, just with a bit of improvisation. So in this case, I am just going to build up reflections where my gut tells me they should live, and my focus is just going to be on absolutely hammering in as much contrast as possible. You'll be able to decide for yourself very quickly if you like this method enough to want to do it. And if you don't like this method, then just paint true metallics here. This miniature will not suffer for being painted with true metallics. I am choosing to do non-metallics here purely because I think that that's the sort of good board gamey look, because it kind of apes traditional art, which is what you'll find in all the rule books for your favourite board games, roleplay games, etc. So I like to do non-metallic because I feel like it makes the miniatures fit the art style of the games themselves. But that doesn't mean that it is correct to do non-metallic. It means that that's my preference for role-playing oriented miniatures. Correct is whatever gets you the results you want. I've got patrons who only paint with contrast paints, even though I never paint with contrast paints. I've got patrons who are absolutely stunning competition level painters. There are all manner of painting styles and motivations and methods of execution that are equally valid and that have different applications in different places. It's not all about right and wrong, and we do, especially war gamers. I find that maybe the role-playing community is probably a bit less guilty of this, but war gamers especially love to think of things in very binary terms. It's this or it's that. And painting just doesn't break down that neatly. It's just not one of those things in life that you can chop up like that into very simple binary constructs. Painting is very open to interpretation and preference and mood and feel, and there being many ways to skin whatever your preferred thing that you wish to skin is. Don't want to disrespect anyone who may be of a vegan persuasion, so perhaps you may wish to skin a banana. That is a perfectly reasonable thing to skin, and power to you for doing it. I actually love vegan cooking. I find it very interesting. I'm not vegan, I eat meat, but I do find animal-free cooking to be fascinating. But I digress. We're here to talk about miniature painting. And I just think it is very important to keep in mind just how variable and open to interpretation miniature painting is and should be. At the end of the day, all forms of painting share that commonality, that they are expressive, and that one person's correct may not work at all for the next. The better we are at being aware of that and taking that into account, the easier it is to kind of fathom which skills you want to learn and which techniques you like. Okay, so that's the first layer done. Looks nothing like gold at the moment, but we are one step closer. So when we come back, we will do the next. Right, so for the next part of our non-metallic metal, I've just added some more yellow. You can see the colour's gone up a bit now, so I've just mixed some more yellow into the same. And this is where you're going to want to start thinking about a bit of edge highlighting as well. You don't have to do tons, but it never hurts to do a bit. So if you're not a fan of the edge highlighting, it's probably the one area where non-metallic will not appeal to you, because there isn't really a way around it. The edge highlighting sort of helps define the shapes, which with non-metallic is kind of important. I personally do not like doing tons of edge highlighting. If I paint, like a Space Marine, for example, you can guarantee I'm probably going to be doing almost entirely volumetric, and then maybe a touch of edge highlighting just to kind of polish the deal off. But chances are there's not going to be a ton of edge highlighting present, because it's just not my cup of tea. But when it comes to non-metallic, you don't get a ton of choice, because you don't really have another way to clearly define light shining off of all of the edges, which if you look at rendered metal when it has light on it, is exactly what it does. You'll tend to find that all of the sort of extremities will be lit as a way of how metal reflects light. So it's kind of a bit of a necessary evil in this case. You can still, to taste, keep it fairly minimal if you wish to. Whatever you think looks good. For me personally, if I'm doing non-metallic, I'll probably do a fair bit of it. If I'm doing anything else, I'll probably avoid it as much as possible. But as what we're painting right now is non-metallic gold, we are going to have to do a bit. So my apologies if you don't like it. I do sort of make a point of saving it until the last sort of the brighter colours of my non-metallic workups. Some painters will put that in, or start putting it in almost straight away, the edge highlighting. So I'm doing my best to save you some work, but there's only so much you can do. Some of it you can just side brush anyway. You just sort of get the side of the tip of your brush and, you know, it kind of puts it in for you, so you don't really have to carefully run in an edge highlight in those cases. It's quite nice when that happens, but not all of it will be that kind, unfortunately. Can see that once we get this kind of brighter colour starting to go in, it is now starting to hint at us that it might look like metal one day. That's a pretty good feeling, especially if you've never done this before. If it's your first rodeo trying to do a non-metallic metal, then that sort of tipping point where you first get the impression of, oh, this is going to look like metal, that's you know, it's a really good feeling. So if nothing else, give this a go just for that, just to be able to say that you've experienced that. This is definitely the finest part of the painting. I'm not going to lie to you on the, you know, I did say the non-metallic, whilst not relative to other ways of doing non-metallic, this is a pretty easy way. But I said at the start, you know, it's not going to be one of the easier parts of the Mini. This is one of the toughest parts of the Mini that we're currently tackling, so, you know, we need to have our strong-willed hats on for this section. But then, you know, think of the sense of achievement when you get to the end of it. Again, if you're not someone who's painted non-metallic before, if you're someone that normally shies away from it, you're going to get to the end of this and go, hey, I did something I've never done before. And that's going to feel alright. You know, you're not going to be mad about that. A little tiny error there. Normally, I wouldn't correct this on the fly, but I've actually got to get some more Rhinoxide out because I've ran out on the palette. So if I don't correct it on the fly, I may well forget to get Rhinoxide out and then forget to correct it altogether. So I don't want to do that. I just allowed this highlight here to spill outside of its boundary. So that is now fixed. And once again, looking beautiful. Okay, back to work. You can see for a lot of the strokes we don't have to be super careful. Like when it comes to the top of the lantern here, I'm laying in pretty fast strokes. You know, it's not all super precise, headachy painting when it comes to painting non-metallic. It's just that is part of it, you know, and you have to be kind of mentally prepared for the fact that some of it is going to be concentration intensive, you know, knuckle down and get it done sort of painting. We don't all want that in our painting experience, you know. Some of us don't want that ever. You know, not everybody wants painting to contain challenges. Some people want painting to be as easy and straightforward as it possibly can be. And the majority of those people, the painting part isn't really the part of the hobby that they love. So you can totally understand why they feel that way. But for me, you know, I most enjoy painting when the majority of the job is relatively low stress, and then there's just a couple of nice little bits that I can knuckle down on and focus and do something a bit special. That's kind of my favourite type of painting, where it's mostly pretty straightforward, and then just every now and again you chuck in a little bit of something posh, just to, you know, overall boost the quality of the piece. And the end result is always very satisfying, I find, but also the process itself is not miserable. And that's the thing that's important for me, is that I want the process to be pretty chill, but I want to be proud of the result, and I'm aware that if I want to be proud of the result, there's a good chance that for at least part of the process I'm going to have to do something tricky. I'm going to have to paint something that's difficult. And so that's where I really like to design paint schemes like this, where the majority of the painting is really loosey-goosey. You know, we're doing all that texture on the leather and stuff like that, and it's really straightforward, and you can't really make mistakes because you're trying to paint, you know, jaggedy lines and incomplete lines and stuff like that. You know, all these things that in a lot of situations you'd consider to be mistakes, you're actually trying to paint those. And then you just get to this one part where you're like, right, for this one section, I'm just going to really knuckle down and make this special. And that to me is super, super fun, and that's why I tend to design paint schemes with that experience in mind, because that's what I like to get from painting a miniature. You know, if it's too easy start to finish, I get bored and I disengage, and that's why my commission service doesn't offer tabletop. It starts at high tabletop, because if I'm, you know, if my entire involvement with a miniature is just to put 3 colours and a wash on it, that isn't going to be fun for me. But then on the other side of that, if every piece that I had to do was, you know, expected to be display/competition quality, I'd also find that too stressful. That wouldn't be fun for me either. So I like a good healthy mix. I enjoy painting high standard stuff, you know, showcase quality stuff, but I don't like it to be all that I do. And this really, what you're seeing now, is the truest expression of my painting, where it's just that nice balance. You know, it's got some really swanky bits and some really simple bits, and the juxtaposition of those together and making them sort of look unified and interesting is where the fun is, you know, in combining those simple things and those highly complicated things and trying to come up with something that still makes sense as a paint job. Some of the most fun you can have with a brush in your hand, in my opinion, but your mileage may vary. And if so, you'll probably not be back to buy another one of these Mini of the Month videos. This will probably be the first and only one that you take part in. I should say, this being the first one of the whole series, of course, you know, I do plan to pay attention to feedback and to refine them. So if you have bought this video and you have feedback, then by all means submit it. contact@thatmrshy.com is the email address. You can drop me an email, give me some feedback, good or bad, about how you felt following this tutorial/painting guide, and I will listen. I can't promise that I'll reply to your email. It depends. I do get very busy. Sometimes there can be a lot of contact coming in. Sometimes there can be very little. Not every email is one that I can reply to. But I can promise that I will take what you say on board, that it will be read and that it will be considered. Okay. Good progress. So, I did just make another tiny error. Unfortunately, all of my errors are just things that can be corrected with Resin oxide. So, I just painted over the shadow coming off of these two diamonds here. They're very easy fixes. And so, that's another stage done. I will, again, just stop the footage for a second, have a sip of coffee, make sure that this is 100% dry, and then when I come back we will do the next stage. Right, the next run in our non-metallic journey is just thinned down Avalon Sunset now. So we're at pure Avalon at this point, and this is where it starts to kind of jump forward a bit. That base work that we've laid down for it is kind of it's sort of there to just create a space for this Avalon to start to do its thing. The Avalon is the kind of main feature colour of the workup, if you will. So this is probably the colour that we'll see most represented in the workup. You may also notice that despite the fact that this lantern is clearly active, we're painting all the non-metallic around it. That is going to become relevant later. So if you want to start trying to guess why, then be my guest. Obviously, as this is a completely non-interactive form of entertainment, there is no way for me to know what you've guessed and whether you got it right, but it might be a fun game to play all the same. Continuing doing exactly what we've been doing before, only we are doing it with yellow. Certainly starting to get into concentration time now, as our strokes need to be finer and more accurately placed. Doesn't mean we're not having fun, it just means we're working a little bit harder. Every stage that we complete we see a little bit more of the fruits of our labours. So, you know, even if the stages do get harder and harder as they progress, even if you do have to be more and more accurate with your brushwork, you also get a bigger and bigger reward, because every time you complete a stage, your results look closer and closer to your finished goal, which in this case is gold metallic. Tiny little error again there. That's a really minor one. You could, again, totally be forgiven for not correcting it immediately, but again, I will. If you can hear the lip smacking sound of me licking my brush, I am a habitual brush licker. I don't really know why they call it brush licking. I can't say as I've ever licked my brush. Brush licking is certainly the phrase that we use as miniature painters, but brush lipping would probably be a more appropriate phrase. The brush, you purse it between your lips to get the point back on it. Never really understood why we call it brush licking. If you're licking your brushes, that's definitely a bit suspect. I can totally understand why folk might be a bit grossed out by that. There's just no need for it. I mean, I don't know about you, but I get grossed out at people licking a lot of things. Just licking in general is a bit of an antisocial activity, isn't it? Again, how far you want to go with this is up to you, but the finer you go and the brighter you go, the more it will look like metal. So it's your choice, but my recommendation would be to bear with it for the entire process, because that's what's going to get you the truest result. To be honest, there's so little miniature painting where we use the last couple of hairs of the brush like this that for me it's actually quite fun. It's its own process, you know, and non-metallic is one of the things that sort of demands that we use that very last portion of the brush for some sort of extended period of time. And that to me is quite enjoyable. It's a good test. But again, I suppose that goes back to that thing that not everybody wants to be tested when they paint miniatures. You know, some people want just the quickest, easiest, passable way of getting paint onto the figure. And we're really all here for different reasons. Starting to get tricky around this weapon. So I'm going to really micromanage my brush strokes. And then the sound of something falling behind me. I'm not sure if the mic will have picked it up because it's It's a unidirectional mic, but something behind me shifted and almost made me jump. It's what made me fidget a little bit, which is never what you want when you're trying to paint this finely. That's always the single worst thing that can happen. But anything that disturbs your calm or your ability to continue to maintain control of where you're placing your brush strokes, that's the stuff to watch out for. Probably one of the most obvious tips I've ever given in my life, but that's part of what you pay for when you go for this long play content. You know, you unfortunately receive my stream of consciousness as much as my instruction. Fine we're painting now, imagine how fine we're going to be on the next step. The good news is, A, you don't have to do as much refining as this. Like, if you don't want to do it, if it's not fun to you, just don't do it. B, you don't have to be as fine in your refinements as I am. Like, it will still look right if it's chunkier than this. It will still look like metal. It will just, you know, it'll just look chunkier, unsurprisingly. If you paint chunkier, things look chunkier. Mr. Shy Sparks painting revelation. But the advantages, or the upside, I wouldn't say we could really call it an advantage by any fair metric, but certainly the upside of that is that whilst every stage is finer and more refined and requires more careful brush strokes, what also happens is that every stage, therefore, as an automatic effect of that, gets smaller, so there's less of it to do. So the harder and harder the painting gets, the less and less of it you actually have to incorporate into your piece. Which is why I always say, try stuff like this, because whilst, yes, the hardest part of it is absolutely hard by anyone's description. You know, no one in the world thinks that the hardest parts of non-metallic are anything other than bloody hard. But the vast majority of what you're painting isn't that hardest part. It's all the lead up to it. Little error there again. I must stop doing that. Barely visible, but once again I won't be satisfied unless I fix it. So I do really want these to be nice paint jobs, you know. I mean, we're probably creeping towards 3 hours now, but judging by my internal body clock, again I have no way of measuring that while we're doing this, and I didn't check the time when I started, so next time I record one of these, maybe I'll check the time when I start to get a good idea. But I imagine we're heading for about the 3-hour mark at this point, and I really am determined to offer you painting guides that will give you a result that you're super stoked with in an amount of time that you're really surprised by. You know, that is absolutely the goal of this little mini of the month project. And I absolutely intend for it to be a flagship feature of my online presence, of what I do. I hope that eventually mini makers will come to me and say, hey, would you be interested in doing this for your mini of the month? You know, hope beyond hope that will be the case. We'll see. But the big important thing for me with this is that these paint jobs lead you to miniatures that you're really stoked with. And so, you know, yes, I am going to push you. I'm going to ask you to attempt things that are otherwise not very comfortable. You know, I'm going to ask you to attempt techniques that you maybe have been a little apprehensive of in the past. And the reason I'm going to do that is because I want you to be super pleased with yourself when you get to the end of this. I want you to look at what you've painted. At the end of the day, you've painted it, not me. You know, you, the person who is watching this right now, are the person who has painted this, and it's yours to be proud of. And I want to do everything that I can to ensure that that's the case. And one of the main things that I can do to ensure that that's the case is to give you tutorials that push you, that make you a little bit uncomfortable, and then out of the other side of it, you realise that something you didn't think you could do is actually well within your grasp. I call that a level up. And level ups are probably my absolute favourite part of studying any subject, learning to improve at anything. Level ups are the thing that I take the most joy in, and seeing people level up is really, you know, what keeps me wanting to do instructional stuff. It's the whole reason I love doing instructional stuff. So whilst it may be a bit like, oh god, if I want to follow this guide I've got to paint NMM. For a start, you haven't. You don't have to paint this the way I'm painting it. You could follow every single part of this guide except the NMM if you wanted to. That's totally an option. It's your miniature and your money. But if you do, then I want to feel like I've done the best job I can of giving you a mini that you're going to be proud of. And so, yeah, we're going to paint stuff like NMM in these videos. We're going to do object source lighting. We're going to do tricky skin tone blending and stuff like that. Absolutely we are. We're going to have a bloody good time doing it. And we're going to get really good results out of it. And as a result of that, you will feel more confident when you paint your miniatures. You'll feel more comfortable with trying other new techniques. And I will get to feel like I'm good at my job. So, you know, everyone wins. Except for this line, apparently, which I just cannot paint. I just made an error and then made another error correcting the error, and then made another error correcting the correction. I think I've now got it. Apparently this line is my nemesis today. Okay, we've got it. Let's go nowhere near that for the rest of the miniature. Okay, just a little more. We're almost there. a little bit of repairing here, just a bit unhappy with the straightness of some of the line work and stuff, so I'm just dipping back in briefly just to neaten things back up. Error correction is very much one of those things where, like, if it feels convenient to stop what you're doing and just do it, then by all means feel free to do that, but never feel like you have to immediately make those corrections. It's really completely your choice. Obviously make them, you know, don't just finish a miniature and leave what you know is an error in it, because you will only be annoyed at yourself for that. You know, that's the only conclusion to that decision, is that you'll be pissed at yourself. But at the same time, you know, when you correct it is totally your choice. If you want to wait until the end of a section to go back over, look for mistakes and correct them, do that. If you want to wait till the end of the entire workup to look for mistakes and correct them, do that. If you want to stop in the middle of what you're doing, then do that. There isn't you know, a right or wrong way to approach it. There's just whatever works best for you. And for a lot of people, that's going to be waiting until the end of that workup. But for me, it really does vary. You know, sometimes I'll want to jump straight back on it. I've got a really tricky reflection to put in here, so we're going to hold the miniature in an extremely awkward way. This is on the underside. Sorry, there we go, I got it on camera. On the underside of the arm. You might be saying to yourself, well, why do you need to have a reflection on the underside? But when I turn the model the right way and you look at it, you see, it now makes complete sense for it to be there. It's this one just here. Makes complete sense for it to be there. And spotting little bits like that is going to make a big difference. That section. I've just spotted a mystery leather strap from the red section that I didn't spot. You remember I said I'm going to save some of that red just in case. This is why you do it, folks. This is why whenever you're working with custom colours, if you then base something else off of them, always save a little bit, because you will be kicking yourself if you don't. But because we are all clever little painters, we did, and therefore we have nothing to fear. Right, I think we can now progress on to the next stage of the non-metallic. There's actually two stages of the non-metallic left, but one of them is so minor, so unbelievably minor. So we'll be back in a second with the next stage. Right, so we've now introduced some white into the Avalon Sunset. You can see how much brighter it is. And at this point we're really just starting to paint in little reflections now. So we don't have to cover very much ground, which means that things start to get a bit simpler and a bit easier, even though we are now having to paint probably the finest we've painted on the whole piece yet. So we're just going to start plotting in these reflections now. And these are just the areas where we want those little winks of light, where the metal is just sending the intense light back at the viewer. So just a bit of careful control here and there. And before long, we'll have exactly what we're looking for. You'll notice again at this stage, because I'm getting up into really bright highlight again, I'm starting to knock a bit of texture in as well, just here and there, because this is the best way to simulate sort of surface scratches. If we just do it in the sort of last stage of highlight, then we know that they're going to be very visible, which, you know, at the scale that we're painting this kind of miniature, it's pretty hard to get things like little surface scratches in a piece of metal looking visible. So if you do want to put them in, then I'd recommend just waiting, as I am here, until you're in the sort of closing stages of your highlighting, and then starting to build them in. That includes with this sculpt. This sculpt is incredibly detailed. There are actually some scratches hard sculpted into some of the metal parts as well. So we can also paint those in if we wish, with just a little bit of highlight. Draw some attention to them. Something worth pointing out here as well, I said I've started to introduce some white in here. White traditionally is a paint with quite bad flow, and a lot of the white paints that you encounter, you will find that they're pretty bad for flow, and when it comes to obviously trying to paint all these fine little edge highlights for your non-metallic, as soon as you introduce that white, it's going to start to kill the flow of your paint. So there are two white paints that I've found in the 30 some years I've painted miniatures. I'll say 30 something is pretty much bang on 30 actually. There are 2 white paints I've found that have really good flow. 2 that I recommend. One is Dragon White from Reaper Master Series, which is a good one. And the other that I'm using today is Titanium White from Pro Acryl, which is Monument Hobbies paint brand. I don't tend to give like hard paint recommendations too often these days, you know, unless people are specifically asking for them. But when it comes to whites, because of that sort of really bad flow problem that you can often experience, if you want a white that's going to serve you well when you're doing highly detailed stuff, I would really recommend picking up one of those 2. They are pure whites, so they're not, you know, they're functionally very different to something like a Corax white from Games Workshop, which is actually like an off-white. You know, a Corax white is going to be really good for laying down a flat base coat that you wish to put white over, for example. Whereas these are a pure white, so you can use them for different applications. You wouldn't want to mix Corax into this, for example, to do your sort of big bold highlights, because the sort of grey tone to it would just pull all the vibrancy out of your yellow, and that would be a tragedy when you've worked so hard to create it. So you're going to want, for stuff like this, a nice pure white that has nice flow. That's why I recommend those 2. The Dragon White in particular actually really surprised me when I first started using it, because it can actually really cover as well. You can get it solid over black in about sort of 2.5, maybe 3 coats, which, you know, for a pure white is very impressive. Corax White does about the same, but like I say, that's an off-white, you know, it's specifically designed to do that job. It's made solely for coverage. So when somebody comes out with a pure white that can achieve that, it is, you know, it's impressive, and it's worth noting. So if you are in the market for a pure white that has good flow and good coverage, then I'd probably lean actually slightly towards the Reaper one personally, but they're both good. And this one happens to be the one that's on my desk at the moment, so this is the one that I'm using today, the Pro Acryl one, but they are both good. They're both worth your hard-earned. See how there's so little surface area to paint in this colour, that even though we are really having to concentrate and paint carefully, it's not really hard or stressful, because we've only got to do tiny little touches here and there, and then we're on to the next area. There's a lot of instant gratification when you get to this point, especially because obviously this is now really starting to finish the sell that this is metal. So to encounter those flow issues now. Whilst the ones that the paints that I'm recommending, they might be better, they're still not perfect. Also, I just realised I was off camera for quite a few minutes then. I'm very sorry for that. I was just working on this area here and starting to battle the white now a little because I'm getting into painting really fine little bits like studs and those kinds of things. Me. This is getting tricky. I'm trying to find a good handhold position now. This is a grand example of what I was talking about, where how at certain points you really have to fidget around to try and find a good handhold. It can be very, very tough. This is certainly one of the areas where I'm perhaps most likely to struggle to stay in shot, because I'm constantly having to wiggle the piece around to get an angle to paint certain parts. There's really very little I can do about that. So again, if you are someone who is frustrated when the Mini goes out of shot, I'm very sorry. I hope that my explaining is at least enough to allow you to continue to follow what we're doing from a painting perspective. Of underlit reflections in here. That's another really tough position to get an angle on. I wonder if I can lean my whole Mini back to help with that. see I've had to, I don't know if you can see from this angle, but I've had to move my fingers right up the paintbrush to be able to find a spot to get in here. This is literally just to paint sort of an underlit angle to these fine little pieces here. One of the unfortunate things with non-metallic is that you do find that you have to sort of edge highlight some of the undersides just to make shapes look clear, make them look defined. Obviously we wouldn't normally really worry too much about edge highlighting the undersides of things, so it can lead to some situations where you're hunting for some very odd angles that you wouldn't necessarily normally have to go hunting for. Be a little bit on the trickier side. So now I'm just having to just do a little bit of repair work. Maybe where I've, over darkened or over lightened certain areas, just get them back into good working order, making sense with the rest of what's going on. Okay, I think that's better. So then for the last, I'm going to go straight into this just because it is the last part. We go to an almost pure white now. It's really just touched with yellow, you can barely even see it, and this is just for picking out just a few little spots here and there where you want a bright reflection. What I would probably do is focus first of all on whatever the sort of intended main viewing angle of the mini is, and then go out from there. If you want to do more from there, then obviously you can and you should do as much of this as you want to do, but the main place that I would really try to make it count is the intended main viewing angle of the miniature. As we are just picking basically just dots here and there now, we can afford to just invest this one last little bit of time. It's not as if what we're doing is tricky now. This is where it gets easy again comparatively. That previous part of the workup is probably the hardest part, that sort of pale yellow, that one or the one before it, because that's where you have to do all those weird edge highlights in awkward places and that kind of stuff. Relative to the other stuff that we've done, this is probably the easiest part. And you can see how instantly transformative it is as well. Like, as soon as you lay that white on, it just instantly goes, hi, I'm metal. Believe it or not, that's actually not the same line, but it is the same area of the miniature where I've just made another error. This was the part that was being a bit of a demon earlier, but not quite exact same area. That's okay, we can fix it. Every problem can be fixed. Just go back in with some yellow, some brown. Get things painted back in before you know it. Everything looks lovely again. There you go. Nice and easy. It starts to get really simple at this point. It's almost just going through the motions, you know, you're just sort of scanning around and finding the next part that you've got to fill in, quickly dropping the colour in and moving on. It becomes pretty easy, pretty straightforward. Tiny edge highlight here. Okay, that looks good. Same here, I want a tiny little dink just there. Just the last couple of bits up on the mace. Okay, so that we're just coming to the end to now, this is the single longest and hardest process of the whole mini, and again, because I was an idiot and didn't check the time at the start of this, I'm not sure exactly on time coverage, but as we come up to the end of this gold now, I would be surprised if that's taken us more than an hour, and that's the single most technical and demanding part of the entire miniature, which is kind of, you know, the value of doing simplified versions of certain workups, especially something like non-metallic. There's a whole heap of value in simplifying something like that, because the fact that we can have a miniature that contains non-metallic but, you know, be aiming for a sort of certainly sub 5 hour. I would like sub 4 hour, but we'll see. I'm certainly not gonna, you know, rush the finish for the sake of it. But to be able to, you know, have a miniature that includes a good-looking non-metallic workup, not god tier, not the most advanced, but good, and to get that in a workup that short, I think is great. So from here, we will now do the silver next. Okay, so before I start the actual silver proper, the first thing I want to do is just repair some of the areas around these little gold fillets here that we've put in. Obviously, it's very, very difficult to not paint outside of such a small shape, so there's just the odd area here and there where we just want to repair some of the grey before we start doing the gold. That's pretty straightforward. I did just off-camera mix a colour matched grey just to expedite things a little bit when I turn the camera back on. Nonetheless, it's all simple and straightforward from here. And this silver workup's going to be way simpler because we're doing, for the most part, we're doing a very worn looking silver. We want it to look really like weathered and I suppose more like kind of towards beaten iron than silver. I'm using silver more as a generic term there to mean, you know, grey metal, as opposed to specifically meaning the actual material silver. So we've got, like I say, a couple of places to look at this. The first is the hammerhead, and that's easily the most prevalent as well. That's the one that there's the most of in the piece. So what I'm going to do first of all is just start tonking a bit of white into our grey and just really roughly working up some volumes. And like I say, this is going to be way simpler with this because we're actually shooting very deliberately for something that looks more hammered and beaten and not well kept, not brilliant or anything like that. So when it comes to the undersides here, we'll be working in some texture later throughout everything. When it comes to the parts that are in shadow, then we'll start bringing the texture in with this first colour. Okay, now we can skip a step for the rest of the silvers because we want the contrast to be a bit more sudden on those. And again, just rinse and repeat. You'll see, because we're doing so much of the same thing, most of this will be probably in one shot. Just caught the edge of his hat there. I mean, that's fine, I've still got those browns on my palette, so I can always correct that back out anyway. You see, again, I'm being very textural, very dabby with my brush. You know, I'm not really trying to sort of lay in really heavy solid strokes. I'm just kind of tapping away, letting colour build up. And that's really the key, is letting colour build up, understanding that, you know, paint is supposed to be transparent to a degree. And, you know, you kind of have two options, right? You can go for solid coverage, where you let paint build up so that it's all uniform in colour, or you can aim to be adjusting the colour of paint as it builds up, and that's where you get your more sort of blended effects. So that can range from layering, where the paint is relatively thick, all the way down to glazing, where the paint is literally like dirty paint water, you know. and those various different applications of layering paint of different thinnesses is what creates different amounts of smoothness in your blends. So here we can now start to pull in a highlight just across this. This is our little ring from earlier. The little ring just on his buckly bit down here. Go, and then back to this. Again, just keeping this building up with texture. Maybe just a little bit more over here. That's more like it. And we'll go brighter still. It's probably going to be like every 2 highlights that I need to go into the other areas, but we'll see. Ooh. Okay. No, that looks pretty good. Just hit the top of the ring this time, not the bottom. Or maybe we'll hit the bottom as well, actually, now that it's in. Sometimes context matters, you know. Sometimes you need to see the context that the paint is going to go into in order to make that judgment call for what needs to be happening around it. Okay, so I'm going to add a really bright highlight just to the bits that aren't the mace. There is a reason for that. So on the bits that aren't the mace, we're almost finished. Get that really bright highlight in there. And then again, just follow that up with near white. I'm actually using the same one from the gold here, because it just doesn't matter. Okay. So, I just need the lower highlight to be a bit thicker here. Maybe a bit thinner here. Yeah, something like that. So just rounding it off a touch here and there. It's always worth just having a little play like this and adjusting on the fly if you feel something doesn't look right. Sometimes just by messing around for a few minutes you can just kind of find it, and suddenly where you were a bit lost and not really sure what to do, you've got something workable. Yeah, I'm pretty happy there. So this top part, obviously right now, doesn't look particularly like that kind of beaten metal that we wanted it to. It's far too grey for a start. And what we're going to actually do to start to create that story is we're going to glaze. And again, this might be your first time doing glazing. You might be a seasoned pro, but we're only going to do a little bit, so it won't be that bad. This is the thickness of my paint. You can see it is extremely transparent, and I've also just taken some tissue and gotten rid of most of it, so there's very little on the brush. And we're just going to glaze down, glaze in, away from our highlights. What this is going to do is, the black that I'm using is kind of blue toned. Some blacks can be green toned, some can be blue toned. It's very, very uncommon to get a black that is true neutral. But what that means is that as I'm highlighting up, it's starting to get a bit of a cold tone to the highlight. So if I now start to interject some warm tones, like with this really dark brown, for example, I can create some additional contrast in my workup. And it kind of just happens, you know. It's very easy to do. You just keep building up these glazes. And I'm really just sort of rubbing these into the areas. It's not like a normal glaze where the direction of your brush stroke really, really matters. You want to be pushing towards the shadow, but you can get a bit scrubby like I've been doing. It's not going to break anything. This is just going to give us a little spot more contrast before we dot in our final reflections, so that when we then grab a really bright colour and come back to our final reflections, we've already got stacks of contrast present. And it's pretty easy for us to convincingly tell the story that this is metal. You know, we want it to be that very sort of beaten up, forged iron kind of thing, because it's a mace head, right? It's a giant bloody mace head. It doesn't want to be some delicately polished metal. It wants to be some really beaten up, chunky metal. And I think that just by dotting those white specks on after shading with the brown, I think that really helps give us that look. That works for me. Okay, while we're still in this shot, we'll do one very quick bit. You remember earlier we base coated the face covering in this dim red colour, same colour that we started our leather in. We're now just going to get a bright red and just work a bit of volume into the middle of that. It's going to be a couple of pops of colour on this guy, but I'm going to put that in there now, because we're going to quickly do the skin tone now. There's not a lot of skin to paint on this miniature, but when we come back we'll be putting the skin in. So for anything that's like gothic horror, there's a particular pair of flesh tones that I really like to work with, which is these two. So these are actually Vallejo paints, but they're made for Nocturna. And you've got Nocturna Shadow and Natural Flesh. This is essentially just a desaturated dark green, and this is like a basic flesh tone. So you will have analogues for these even if you don't own these specific paints. So I would say, you know, don't worry if you don't have exactly these two paints, but I also would highly recommend trying them. And what we're going to do for our flesh work up here is pretty cool. So we're going to just kind of do a similar thing to what we did with the non-metallic, where we start at a base tone and just keep adding more and more of a highlight tone into it, and that'll be the initial beginnings of the flesh tone. So we'll base the fingers, the thumb, same on the other hand. Face. Might need to thin it a touch more for the face, but it should be okay. So I fully expect to touch that face covering here, so because I know what I'm like, which is why I've not bothered finishing it yet. I started tapping that bright red in because I wanted the context. I wanted to sort of have a rough idea of how the skin would look next to bright red, not dull red. That's why I just tapped that quick bit of bright red in. But in terms of actually finishing the skin, I'm not in a rush. I'm not in a rush to do the face scarf until after I finish the skin. So now we're going to take the natural flesh, and we're going to end up with this like pale desaturated sickly green colour, and at first you're going to be like, what the hell are you leading us to here? You're going to really be confused, like, why are we painting his skin green? He's not a zombie. But bear with me. Is if you watch my YouTube channel, I did a painting tutorial for the Sigvold the Magnificent, which is like a big beautiful golden armoured demon prince of Slanesh, and in that I used basically this exact same workup. Pretty much one for one. It's a workup I really, really enjoy for like any kind of gothic horror, fantasy horror skin tones. I just really feel like it works great. Okay, and then another chunk of the skin tone into it, and it's now going to start to lean in the direction of skin tone. It doesn't take many layers for this to start start to become recognisable as a skin tone. Getting under this hat can be a bit tricky, but we shall do our best through perseverance. Again, onto the fingers. And then we can bring in the natural flesh on its own, maybe with just a slightest little taint of the green in it. So what we end up with is just this really nice kind of pale, deathly looking skin tone. I'm going to grab just a bit of actual black here. Just work it right into the very tip of my brush. And pop a black line between the face and the scar. Just real quick. And then just go back in and bring that bright red up. And then I'm going to add a touch of our orange from earlier as well. I don't want this to go mega bright, but I do, I need to represent a level of highlight to it, so just tap a couple of little sort of orange highlights in there, and that gives us a pretty good effect. There we go. Now if I want to, this is very much optional, but I will show it to you because it's a thing that I quite like to do. If you take some red and really heavily thin it, and I do mean really heavily thin it, you can actually just run it into the sort of edges of your skin tone, and it will just liven it up a touch more. It will just sort of make it look a bit more vital again, a bit more alive. So if the skin tone is a bit too dead for you, if you're not quite a fan of how undeadish or zombie-like it appears, just really heavily thin some red and just glaze it in, and after a couple of layers it will suddenly come back more towards a kind of living tone. This can be really good around things like knuckles where you kind of want a bit of that redness anyway, so I quite like it for those kind of applications. And then it also can be a good idea just to grab some of the original skin base tone, add a touch more black to it, and just double check your deepest recesses as well, just to make sure that they're dark enough. The thing with skin tones, in my opinion, is that it's all about range. It's all about that, what they call the contrast coefficient, which is just a really swanky way of saying the level of difference between the brightest and darkest tone that you've used. So you'll sometimes just need to kind of lay down something very basic and then fiddle about a bit, and that is often how you get the nicest skin tones, just by being willing to mess around a little. I mean, even, you know, if we wanted to, we could even introduce some white to this skin tone and just attack, you know, the very brightest little highlight points like this. There's nothing wrong with doing that if that is, you know, a stylistic thing that you like, having the knuckles and usually the tip of the nose super highlighted. Those are kind of, they're more hallmarks of like popular wargaming miniatures than the more sort of Dungeons and Dragons-y kind of style, but it's all good. And then from there, I did realise that I forgot to dot some bright colour onto these silver buttons. So again, this is just my bright grey. Just need a bit more water adding back into it. It's thickened up a touch. So we just go back and visit that again. Yeah, right, and then we've got one more really easy workup, and then one more quite technical workup. In fact, I tell a lie, before we go to that, I'm just gonna very quickly highlight the band of this hat a tiny bit. I was umming and ahhing what colour that band was gonna be, which is why I've not kind of mentioned it to this point, but I think it's gonna be black. So I'm just going to put a couple of very simple grey highlights on it. And then just pop in with some very thin black. And hit a dark line just above it to separate it. It's all neat and tidy. And that is honestly that for the band on the hat. There's really no need to go mental with it. Says immediately wanting to do more. One of the fun things about making these videos for me is that whilst I may kind of come up with most of the colour scheme in advance, there will always be little things that I decide to improvise in the moment. Because that's just the kind of painter I am. I see stuff and I get ideas, you know. So, whilst there is a degree of structure there, or a degree of planning, there's also just that tiny little hint of chaos that makes it a lot of fun. There we go. Alright, so that's the band on the hat done. And we'll come back in a second for a really easy workup before we do another hard one. Sorry. Almost cut the thing without showing you the miniature. There you go. This is where we're at so far. Right, so let's do one of the really easy workups then. This is one of the workups in the whole piece that's nothing really. It's just the bandage wraps around here, and I'm filling them in with a mixture of the flesh highlight colour actually, and some of the titanium white. And I'm only doing that because that's just stuff that's on my palette, and I think when you're painting single minis, stuff that's on your palette is a good way to choose colours. But you know, some sort of pale, bony, beigey, biscuity kind of tone is about where I want to be at. And once again, we're going to have a bit of tricky turning of the miniature to reach the inside of this. Again, just part of the joys of single piece miniatures. You soon get used to it. But it's, I can see why it stresses some people out. Like, some people really don't like miniatures with hard to reach areas. And they'll, you know, sub-assemble every multi-part kit that they get and stuff like that. But that's too much effort for me. Okay, so we don't need like amazingly perfect coverage here, but I also, you know, there's no point in half-arsing it. We may as well make sure that we've got reasonable coverage. Okay, that'll do. And then I'm going to hit that with a couple of different washes actually. So again, this will be one of the few applications of washes in this piece. I'm going to want Seraphim Sepia from Games Workshop, Agrax Earthshade from Games Workshop, and Ethermatic Blue Contrast Paint. So these are the shades I'm going to use. Again, this could be substituted for just thin down blue paint. Float your boat really. So the sepia, first of all, is going to go pretty much all over. Wouldn't feel like I had to fall on my sword if I missed the very top, but this will just sort of give it a nice kind of golden tone for us. And I'm going to run a hairdryer between these washes just to get them done quickly, so there's going to be a succession of cuts, the first of which is now. Okay, we're back after a cut. So I'm now going to grab the Agrax Earthshade and I'm going to sort of target more the underside. And just kind of flick up every now and again into the bulk of the area. But for the most part, just keeping this to the obvious shadow areas, and once again struggling to get at this inside part. It never hurts to do a few sort of streaks here and there. Adds a bit of depth where, you know, some bandages are folded over others, whatever. Like a good old fabric wrapped weapon. And just continuing to build up most of this wash towards the bottom. When you use washes really sparingly like this, they actually dry rather quickly. So the first wash with the sepia, because that was like an all over, I hair dried that. but this one's actually dried pretty much, you know, basically as I'm painting it for all intents and purposes. Just remembered there's a bit on the side of the hat that I need to fix. Got a bit of grey on there when I was doing the mace head. Push a bit of brown back in. Okay, back to our waxing. Again, just continuing to build this more towards the underside. And then we can be pretty generous with it under the lip of where we change to the gold. That's a safe bet for an area where you'll want a bit of definition, even if you don't necessarily want the shadow. You'll want the sort of definition that it brings by having the shadow there. And then finally that Ethematic Blue contrast paint, which is probably the surprise of this whole workup, but you'll see it has a really nice effect. We'll just use that to tint shadow. And then we can go back to our highlight colour. You can see this whole workup is very, very quick. It's just one isolated area, so and just whip some nice little thin texture lines across the upward facing surface just to bring back some light there. We're still letting a bit of that green show through, even where we're highlighting. We're still allowing it to be present to a degree. We're not completely wiping it out, but it is mostly there for its effect on the shadow and the midtone. Okay, we're going to tackle something that is quite scary for a lot of folks, but we're going to try and do it in a fairly simple and approachable way. We're going to look at an object source lighting, okay? So this sensor here, excuse me, the first thing I'm going to do is, using this real dark green, I'm going to base coat the smoke and the actual barrel of the sensor itself. And you'll notice that I have filled in all of that non-metallic metal, and if this sensor is going to have a glow, then a lot of that non-metallic metal is going to get overpainted by that glow. You would not be wrong in coming to that conclusion, but again, it goes back to that thing that I mentioned a couple of times in the video of context. With the context of our non-metallic metal in place, it's a lot easier to decide how we want to approach this. So whilst it may seem weird to paint something in only to paint over it, I mean, also we're not going to just straight up paint over it as if it wasn't there anyway. So, you know, there's also that. Like, it is going to play a part. So once you've got solid coverage on the smoke and the sort of bars of the sensor, you're probably about ready to progress. So what I'm going to do first of all is go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and I'm going to paint in the actual light source. So I've got this really bright neon green as well. And this is a P3 paint called Necrotite Green, but it's intended to be like an analogue for Games Workshop's Moot Green, which I know is a very popular, very common paint. So I'm going to kind of dot that in first of all. And this is not necessarily the brightest that this workup's going to go, but this is a good way to just sort of map it out for myself. I'm going to dot that in to the areas where I actually want the light to be originating from. It doesn't matter too much if I overspill or anything like that. It's, you know, it's all good. Okay, what I'm trying to do here is just create the story of this lit situation that I need to start turning into paint. So we're just painting fairly roughly into these gaps. Okay, and that allows me to now start to pick up on some ideas for where the glow is likely to live. So for example, the underside of this NMM is almost definitely going to be being affected, as is this and this. Very unlikely that they're going to escape the glow because they're right beside it. But the lantern itself here is probably going to shield a lot of this, the actual shape of the lantern, because it's kind of got that overhanging lip to it. It's probably going to shield a lot of the top here. So what we'll do is just a little bit of sort of flood over that just kind of starts to touch that, but not really go too crazy. Just the slightest little tint of green to it. Now, this area of the miniature, we're definitely going to be having some glow coming in around here. That much is for certain. So we'll start to glaze in this dark green. And a lot of these glazes will honestly just not even really look like they're doing very much at first. But what they are doing is depositing dark green into the recesses, because they're quite heavy glazes. And dark green in the recesses is what we're going to want for this glow. It's possible that even the tip of our cross here would be kissed. Say a bit of the metal on the chest will be affected. Something like that. Yeah, I like the idea that the hand is kind of shielded by the shape of the lantern. Okay. Starting to get something cool going on now. Just nip round the back and repeat across the metallics here. And again, some of the clothing in this area is bound to be getting caught by this glow, so we'll just glaze some of the green, the dark green, into these areas. pretty happy with what I've mapped in there. So now we're going to switch to that really bright green. And again, as a glaze, so it's very, very thin. You can see it barely has any effect when you lay it down. But we can just start to kind of slowly build in light. And what we want to be doing here is basically the closer we move to the lantern, the more of this green glaze wants to be present. So now that we've laid in our map and sort of decided where the light will hit using a very low impact colour, you know, using a colour that doesn't kind of harshly affect anything, we can now come back with a much more impactful colour and say, okay, now let's start choosing how bright that effect is and laying that in. Because we've got the guide of that previous darker green, we're able to build up with relative subtlety. Now, this is a bit slow, so I may cut and do a quick hair drying and then come back and continue. I think I'm going to do that. Right. So I've done absolutely no additional painting. I only cut so that I could just hair dry the area. I'm going to do all the painting on camera. A little blob there. That can happen when glazing. Sometimes if you crunch the tip of your brush into a part of the miniature, it will just discharge all of the paint that's loaded into it. Something to just watch out for. It can be an issue. It's usually fine, but it can be a problem. Normally with glazes, you've got a lot of time to react, so you don't tend to need to worry if that does happen. You don't tend to need to panic or act rashly or anything. But you can see all I'm doing here is just continuing to stroke this brighter green in. And the closer I get to the lantern, the more of it I want to build up. So it's very, very simple. And again, you know, this is a chopped down version of the technique, if you will. You know, it is a deliberately simplified, and for some people's taste, it will be oversimplified. But the idea is to get you trying it, you know, to move you away from being worried about doing it and get you actually giving it a go. So I've now grabbed some thicker green paint. This is still, I mean, it's still thin by anyone's measures, but it's thicker than what we've been working with. And I'm actually starting to kind of more assertively paint the light on now as opposed to just glaze it on, because I'm starting to get enough of a build up now that I have a clear idea of where things need to live. So I can now kind of start to jump in with some slightly more assertive painting and actually tell this glow where it's going instead of sort of inviting it to do its own thing. And again, I'm keeping the paint thin enough that an impression of what was underneath it is still there. I'm not trying to just wipe it out, you know, the painting that we did previously. But at the same time, I want a good, strong, assertive light source. So if I just sat there and glazed for the whole procedure, it would take me a really, really long time to get to that. I'll now start working into the flames as well. Or smoke, should I say. They're not flames, they're definitely smoke. Again, just sticking with this. Very thin, but not a glaze consistency paint. I sometimes refer to this as a heavy glaze, but I think even that is a little bit misleading. Like it has coverage. It just has, you know, less coverage. So like I said, I don't intend for this to be as bright as it gets. I intend to go brighter. So once I get to the point where I feel like I'm starting to kind of fill up on how much of this bright green we can feasibly take, it's at that point that I will then start to think about where I want to go from there. So sort of built up the smoke cloud quite a bit by this point. That's looking pretty good. The OSL on the lantern is all coming together now. So you can see I've almost, just on the very front facing part of the lantern, I've almost wiped out everything that was there. But like on the top and stuff and on the underside, it's like it's all still as was originally. So that's what I mean about how it is, you know, it is worth doing the other work up first, because you need to be able to decide how much of it you want to wipe out in favour of your glow. You know, you can't make that decision about how much real estate you want the glow to take up without having the context of the neighbouring metallic finish to weigh that off of. So I've about worked this up to where I want it green wise now. So what I'm going to do from here is I'm going to take some of that green and I'm going to try adding yellow to it first. I think it's going to, yeah, so yellow isn't going to do it because it's going to desaturate it too much. Well, the Avalon Sunset that I've got on my palette, should I say, is going to desaturate it too much. I don't really want to go hunting for a bright yellow, so what I'm going to do instead is just a bit of yellow and a bit of white. And again, we'll now start to focus in on deliberately placing some light. actually, you know, calling my shots a little more now. I'm actually aiming this somewhere, as opposed to just kind of plonking it about and seeing where it looks good. There'll maybe be one or two areas where I'll want to bring back my metallic shine using this highlight colour. So, for example, on that buckle there. Okay, and then I'm going to put another dot of white into that now, so I want it to hit like a near white colour. So I do want some pretty intense light. Just saved a little bit of the previous colour just in case there's areas where I want to bring it back down a touch. If it gets too bright, you just knock it back a little bit with your previous colour and you're free to carry on. Touch more white. This looks like it's going to be where I stop. There's only one way to find out. Just any areas where that's got a bit out of control, I can just temper it back with the previous colours. And so that's certainly a way that you can start to get a look at object source lighting. And in fact, I'll tell you what, there is just one last little thing I want to do here. And let's just go back to my dark green glaze a moment. And just push some. I just want a bit more contrast, so just going to push a little bit of that into the extremities of the lantern here, just to open up a bit more range of contrast. Just a bit of back and forth tidying. There's always a little bit of, whenever you're working on a fairly complex workup, there's always just a little bit of admin, you know, a little bit of going backwards and forwards and just tidying things up, and you know, anywhere that you've done something a bit experimental, you might have to just kind of fix a small error, and that kind of thing is just half of the course when it comes to the more technical end of painting. You just sort of have to accept a bit of that. I mean, that's pretty nice and brightly lit now. Focus has disappeared a little bit. Let's just get it back in. There we go. Pretty brightly lit now. I think I'm fairly happy with that. So I'm actually going to do one of the only cuts now where I'll paint off camera. I'm just going to fill the base in quickly. As I explained at the start, you may have different ideas for what you want to do with basing. I'm basically just going to be using greys anyway, and you know, a few bits of sort of thin paint lathered over the top of it and stuff. But also the fact that I actually kind of made a mistake and put this on the wrong base, so I don't want to give you a basing recipe for the base that doesn't actually come with the miniature. So the base that it comes on is pictured in the listing, so you know, it's no problem. But yeah, I'll be back shortly. Okay, so all I did off camera, as I said, just a quick, honestly, sub 10 minutes on the base, probably about like 8 minutes, just very roughly painting the base in, and then the only other thing I did off camera was just give it a spray of matte varnish. And again, that was mostly just to spare you the noise of the airbrush compressor. But that is essentially our miniature complete. And I reckon total painting time, actual painting time, is probably not far off about the 4-hour mark. I will check that, so when I publish it, I'll probably be able to sort of mark it up somewhere to say how long the paint job takes. But I think for getting a game piece ready for your games of Dungeons and Dragons or the such like, about 4 to 5 hours is very, very good. I think that's a great place to be for a workup of this quality. So I hope you like it, I hope you enjoy it, good luck painting, and of course don't forget to get any questions to me if you have them. Thanks a lot, folks.